Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes.
Hey, what's up guys? This is Danny. I produce music underneath the name Ember, but a lot of you guys know me for my vocal engineering. So I just wanted to give a quick video going over my starting point for recording a vocal, or just in terms of the way that I like to process things. So the most important thing that you do right from the beginning is you need to make sure that your vocals aren't recorded too hot or too low. You want to get them at a good level. So this is what you call gain staging. The way that I like to gain stage is I like to basically make sure that my levels are hovering around -12 decibels. So if you give a listen to this vocal.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
You can see that it's kind of hovering around -12 decibels. By the way, shout out to Cooley Uli. I'm going to be using a vocal that I recorded off of their demo Trip. So go ahead and check them out. They're a bunch of really cool guys. But anyways, back to what I was saying. You could tell that it's around -12 decibels over here. And the reason why that's important is because if it's recorded too hot, then it's going to be pumping your plugins way too hard. So the way that you could kind of visually see this is here's a compressor plugin. So check out what happens when I click play.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes.
You could see that it's getting around -5 decibels of gain reduction on the compressor. But if I were to have kept this at the normal levels that it was at, which is around which is at basically like 0 dB, the levels I recorded this at, then check it out.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe
it's not hitting the compressor at all. So in this case, it's not a big deal if it's recorded too quiet, because you could get it and you could just raise it up like that. But if it's recorded too hot right from the get-go, then you're going to be left with no headroom basically to use your plugins. Like, it's going to overactivate them from the beginning. Watch, if it's too hot like this, watch what happens when I click play.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes.
See how it's hitting the compressor a little too hard? So rather than try to control that with like the input and the output gain in the compressor, I like to basically just do that using gain staging. So -12 is like a good spot, and it'll basically leave you with a lot of headroom so that you can mess around with the compressor and it's not going to hit it too hard or anything like that. So once I'm done gain staging, I'll usually start tuning the vocal. I use something called Waves Tune just because I find that it's a little bit more efficient for me and uses less latency than the traditional auto tune. So I'll usually start off by setting up the key. And I like to use I just like to use 20 milliseconds as a starting point on my vocals. And you could go ahead and hear how that sounds.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in.
Now that's for pop vocals. In this specific case, this is more of like an indie rock track. So I don't like to have it as hard. In that case, I'll usually set this at around 45 milliseconds, and you kind of have to play with it for with every single vocal and really just listen. But here's how that sounds.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
All right. And in this case, moving on to the next step, I actually put on a Deplosive plugin by Isotope. I don't usually do this. I only do this in cases where I recorded the vocal badly on accident. And what this basically takes out is sometimes when a vocalist is singing or rapping, when it comes to words like plosives, like P or like B or like P, it'll cause the microphone to kind of pop. And when I put this on, it basically gets rid of it. So that's why this is here for. But I don't usually have that on. That's just a special case for this vocal. From there, the next step, I like to add an EQ plugin on. And the thing that you want to do with an EQ plugin is you want to basically remove all of the stuff in the low end, because basically this doesn't really need to be here. So if you visually look at the vocal,
turned on, tuned in, dropped out, and sunk in to look through new eyes.
You can see that the fundamental of the vocal is hovering around 200 hertz. So since that's where the fundamental of the vocal lies, all of this stuff doesn't really need to be here underneath it. Watch, look, I'm going to solo in on it.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out, and sunk in to look through new eyes.
So none of that really needs to be there. And this will kind of, you might have to play with this. This also kind of depends on the vocal. But generally speaking, all the stuff underneath like 100 hertz on a vocal, it's pretty much just rumble. It doesn't really need to be in there. So once I'm done EQing the vocal, or at least getting rid of the low end, I like to start compressing. So compression is really important. It's probably one of the most important things when it comes to getting the vocals recorded well. So what they basically do is they make the vocals sound more consistent in volume. If you don't have any compression, then the vocal, you might not be able to get a good balance on it. So in this case, I like to start off with something that's called peak compression. So if you look at the audio file, you can tell that the vocal has spikes in it, like right here, right here, right here, right here. And basically, this is just something that you use to get those spikes and bring them down. So I use the CLA 76 by Waves, and I'll click play, and I like to basically do it until there's around like 5 decibels of gain reduction. Watch, like if you check it out.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out, and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something.
So that just helps even out the vocal a little bit. And it's important that you set this up correctly. So the ratio, I like to have around 8, just 8 over here. And then I like to have a really fast attack over here at 7. And then a really fast release also over here at 7. And then the input and output, you basically just adjust until you get it to hit around like 5 decibels of gain reduction. So once I'm done with that, I like to use another compressor. This one's kind of doing more of the work. And I'm using the CLA 2A by Waves. And basically, I like to compress until I get around 7, 10 decibels of gain reduction. Sometimes you have to listen in on the vocal, but that's like a pretty good starting point. So if you listen right here, this is what that sounds like.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out, and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
It just makes the vocal sound a lot more consistent. So once I'm done with that, I'll actually put a limiter on the vocal. So what this is doing is it's making sure that the peaks aren't really poking out. It's totally crushing the vocal. So if you look at my volume over here,
turned on, tuned in, dropped out, and sunk in to look through new eyes.
You could tell that it's kind of hovering around a little bit. Like for the most part, it's pretty low, but it jumps up every now and then. So I like to set a limiter on my vocal, and you kind of have to be careful with this. You don't want to overdo it, otherwise you're going to distort the vocal. But I use the AOM invisible limiter, and I basically put the unity gain on, and I move it up until I start to see some gain reduction up here.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out, and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
So you could see that it's doing basically around -2 decibels of gain reduction, and that's kind of where I want to be. If you do it any higher, then it's going to start to distort the vocal, and it's just totally going to make it sound not good. So you don't want to overdo that. That's just kind of to tighten it up. So if you look at it again now,
turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look.
You could tell that the levels over here are just starting to get totally crushed, which is basically what you want when it comes to vocals, because you need them to be consistent. That's the most important thing. So from there, I'll usually slap a de-esser on. And what this is doing is basically whenever the vocalist has any sort of like S sounds, like s, it just brings them down. It just makes it so they're not so harsh. And I don't always do this on every vocal, but this is just generally speaking. You kind of have to listen. It depends on the vocalist. But if I click play,
turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes.
I like to use it until it's doing around -6 decibels of attenuation. And what it's really good at is it also helps bring down like the T sounds. So from there, I basically send my vocals to a bus send, and that's how I like to do my reverbs. So when it comes to reverb, I like to use a plate reverb by Sound Toys. You could use other reverbs, but this is just the one that I basically found fits my taste the most. I use the Waves reverbs for a very long time as well. The R-verb and a lot of Valhalla reverbs are good. But what's more important is the way that you set it up. So for my go-to, I like to use 2 seconds for the decay of the reverb. And if you go to the I like to set an EQ before my reverb as well. So if you look at this, I like to take out around everything up to like 500 hertz on the reverb. And also up here at the top, I like to take off everything above 10K and a little bit of the mids as well, the high mids. So this is what the reverb sounds like.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
So another important thing that you have to make sure that you're doing is you need to make sure that you're actually side chaining the reverb to the vocal. If you're not side chaining the reverb to the vocal, then the reverb basically sounds too like it overtakes the vocal. Like this is without it.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out to look through new eyes and maybe find something.
So what sidechaining is it basically means that whenever the vocal is playing, the reverb is going to duck a little bit. And then when the vocal stops playing, it's going to come back up. So if you you could visually see this if you just look at this meter right here.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
So I like to use the Waves R compressor to do this. And I basically just have it routed to the vocal, which in this case is set to bus number 1. So from there, the next thing that I like to do is I like to add a delay to the vocal. And when it comes to delay, I pretty much do the same thing. I like to have a side chain on the delay. That way, whenever the delay is playing, it's basically ducking from the vocal. And I also like to EQ out the low end on the delay and EQ out the high end on the delay as well. And that kind of sounds like this.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
And I actually have it set up wrong in this one. So let me actually fix the way that it's set up real quick. I need to set that to the lead vocal right there. So let's try that again.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing. Been looking for someone ever since.
And another important thing is that when you're setting the delay, you need to make sure that the tempo of your host is set at the correct tempo of the song. So in this case, mine is set at 165 beats per minute. And this basically makes sure that the delay is in time with the song. So my go-to starting point on the delay is a 1/4 delay. And I like to use the Waves H delay. And I like to use the ping pong setting, which basically makes it so that the delay, instead of being mono in the center, it moves to the sides around your head, like left and right. And that just basically helps give the vocal a little bit more stereo width. And from there, sometimes what I like to do is I'll also use a stereo widener on the vocal. So I like to use something called the little micro shift. And if you listen to what that sounds like, it's basically just something that's giving the vocal like a little bit more stereo image. So if I silhouette on it, it sounds like this.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes.
So sometimes using that as well will help the vocal sound a little bit better. But you kind of have to be very subtle with it. I'll usually have it all the way down here to the bottom.
Turned on.
And you also have to blend it in with the vocal. So let me put the vocal on.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing.
But you could tell that it's all the way down here, negative 17 decibels on that. But from there, that's pretty much my go-to starting point when it comes to mixing vocals. So obviously this differs a little bit depending on the genre, but for the most part, it's always going to be the same. It's always just basically make sure that you gain stage correctly, make sure that you're EQing. You start off EQing the low end out. Make sure that you're compressing stuff so that the vocals are consistent, and then even a little bit of limiting also helps, and some de-essing. And then from there, the rest sort of depends on the song. This is just how to go about processing the vocal individually, but when it comes to mixing it into the song, vocals need a lot of high end, so sometimes I might do this.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes.
Sometimes using a high shelf as an EQ really helps bring out the sizzle of the vocal. But you have to be careful not to overdo it. Otherwise, it will come out too harsh. But yeah, I think that's pretty much where I'm going to stop. And I'm actually just going to let this vocal play a little bit. So here, this is the way that it sounds now that it's basically processed.
Turned on, tuned in, dropped out and sunk in to look through new eyes and maybe find something I've been missing. Been looking for someone ever since I grew up. Do I know you? Will I find you?
Well, all right, there it is, guys. I hope you like this video. Once again, I have no secrets. This is basically what I'm doing on like the majority of everyone's tracks. So go ahead and copy it and do the same thing that I'm doing, and you guys will be just fine. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.